Okay, I will begin now. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Rania, a student from Fisheries Product Technology Department, pleasantly being your master ceremony for today. And secondly, allow me to welcome to all of the participants to the world-class university visiting lecture, Seafood Quality and Assessment, held by Department of Fisheries Product Technology, Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Diponegoro University. And now we have over 100 participants from around Indonesia, including Sumatra Island, Borneo, Sulawesi, Bali, and Java as well. Based on the application form, 90% of today's event participants are students, 5% are lecturers, while the remaining are categorized to other. Before we begin, it is good for us to start it with prayer. Praying starts from now. Done praying. Let's step up to the next agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to the main event for today, I would like to welcome first the Dean of Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Professor Triwinarni Agustini. Second, I would like to welcome the Head of Department of Fisheries Product Technology, Dr. Putut Haryadi. The third, I would like to welcome Professor Anthony Taylor from University of Lincoln, United Kingdom, as our speaker for today. Hello. And last but not least, I would like to welcome the committee and participants. Welcome. Now we will step to the next agenda. I would like to invite all of us to sit properly because we are going to listen to Indonesia Raya, the national anthem of Indonesia. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite the Dean of Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Professor Triwinarni Agustini, to give the warm opening remarks. Please welcome Professor Triwinarni Agustini.
Okay, thank you very much for time. To the Master of Ceremony. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And good morning for the UK times and good afternoon for the Indonesian time. And first of all, I would like to thank to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala for the grace and His bless to all of us so that we can meet each other for this time to join visiting lecture. This visiting lecturer was under the world-class university program. So I would like to thank also to the Honorable Professor Tony Taylor from the Lincoln University, who has the time and share the experience and give the knowledge to all of us by the visiting lecturer today. The topic of seafood quality and assessment, and it is under the study program of Fisheries Product Technology, Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Diponegoro University. And I would like to thank also to the head of study program of Fish Product Technology, and to the moderator, which is Dr. Fronthea Swastawati. Before we start this visiting lecture, maybe I would like to give a simple explanation about Professor Tony, because we get used to know him for a long time ago. And he used to be our supervisor when we take a master degree. Some of us in the Department of Fish Product Technology. So thank you very much. And his publication on the seafood quality and assessment, we already know that he published for the reputable journal in the world. And I think that his experience will be very useful for all of us. And now this program was the first session for the world-class university that we will conduct for the next 3 sessions for the future. So this is the beginning, and I do hope that all of you can enjoy the visiting lecture for today, and everyone can catch up the information from Professor Tony Taylor. And thank you very much. And once again, thank you to the committee for the good effort till this program can be conducted very, hopefully very useful to the faculty. Thank you very much. And wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Enjoy the visiting lecture.
Thank you, Professor Triwinarni Agustini, for the warm speech. Now, world-class university visiting lecturer, seafood quality and assessment, held by Department Fisheries Product Technology, Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Diponegoro University, is finally opened. Before we are going to the lecture session, we are going to have photo session. And for that, to all of the guests and participants, please turn on the camera and prepare for being captured by the committee. I will be waiting for the guests and participants to open the camera. Please smile, and I will be counting. 1, 2, 3. Okay, again. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much. And now, allow me to introduce our moderator for today. Dr. Fronthea Swastawati is a lecturer at Department of Fisheries Product Technology, Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Diponegoro University. Dr. Fronthea has done her bachelor degree and doctoral degree at Diponegoro University, and her master degree at University of Humberside, United Kingdom. Dr. Fronthea also has a lot of experience in research. The latest is about smoked barracuda quality using liquid smoke. Dr. Fronthea will be leading the next agenda, which are lecture and discussion session. Without any longer waiting, please welcome Dr. Fronthea.
Thank you, Rania Sahya, as Master of Ceremony, for giving me a time and scene. Well, ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Our general lecture is about to begin. Thank you very much for preparing yourself to join our general lecture today. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning to our distinguished guests, Professor Tony Taylor and Mr. Matthew Thompson, who are in the UK. And good afternoon to all of us in Indonesia. First of all, let's pray and thanks to our God who has given us his mercies and blessing until we can attend this event without any obstacles. Secondly, may salawat and salam be with our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who has guided us from darkness to lightness. Honorable Dean of Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Universitas Diponegoro, Professor Triwinarni Agustini, M.Sc. PhD. Honorable Head of Department of Fisheries Technology, Professor Dr. Eko Nurcahya Dewi, M.Sc. To whom I respect, Head of Study Program of Fisheries Technology, Dr. Putut Haryadi, and all lecturer of Fisheries Technology Department. Thirdly, I never forget to say thank you very much to all the committee, and that I'm proud of all participants of this general lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, and all participants, I'm Fronthea Swastawati, the moderator of today's event. I'm very pleased to see you here and welcome all of you to this general lecture. We will discuss about seafood quality and assessment. So our speaker today is Professor K.D. Anthony Taylor. He was a senior academic and head of Food Research Center. Committee, please show the CV. Okay. So Professor Tony Taylor is an active member of the Society of Chemical Industry, for which he organized a series of conferences in food processing, and he was a chairman of ASEAN Food Commodities and Ingredients Group, as well as being an external examiner for BSc and MScs in the food, and he has examined for research degrees at 8 UK universities. Both his BSc and PhD were in biochemistry, but when he moved to Grimsby in 1974, he applied this knowledge of biochemistry to food, and in particular to post-harvest fish research. Aspects of pure research included mechanism of black spots development and quality parameters, biochemical indices and nutritional quality changes in fish during processing and storage. Applied aspects include improved utilization of waste and assessment and reduction of losses in cured fish processing. He has worked extensively in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, as well as in Europe, USA, Kenya, and China. He was awarded the Chair of Food Science in 1992, one of the first in what was then Hammerside Polytechnic. Since retirement from the full-time employment, he has continued to work on a part-time basis at the Holbech campus, and subject specialism of Professor Tony is food science. Before the presentation begins, let me tell you how the presentation will go. First, Prof. Tony will be invited to present the material. After that, there will be a questions and answer session. We will have totally about 90 minutes for lecture and discussion. So our lecturer this afternoon will be divided into two sessions. So for the first session, Professor Tony will give a lecture for 25 minutes and continue to discussion for about 10 minutes. After all, we have short break for 5 minutes, then continue to the second lecture session for other 25 minutes. The last discussion will be taking place for 25 minutes until from the time is finished about 15:55. So now allow me to welcome the speaker, Professor K.D. Anthony Taylor, to make his presentation. Prof. Tony, screen and time is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. It is my pleasure to give a lecture to all the students and staff at Undip. I gave many talks and worked frequently with you back in the 1990s. This morning, however, I have very great help from our information technologist at University of Lincoln in the National Centre for Food Manufacture, Ben Venfield, who has actually recorded my talk, and I'll now pass over to Ben, please, to share his screen and present my talk. At the end of this, I'll come back and I look forward to answering questions. So I have to thank Ben very much indeed for his help in preparing this, and I pass over to Ben now. Thank you. Right, my name is Professor Tony Taylor, and this is the first of two presentations that I'm going to give on fish quality and freshness. This presentation is going to be an introduction and then the use of sensory methods. So let's start with what we mean by quality. Now, there are two definitions of quality that I'm presenting here. The first one is the composite of the various attributes and properties of the product that influence its acceptability to the buyer or customer. In other words, quality means different things to different people, and I'll be talking about this on the next slide. Similarly, the next definition, quality is the degree of excellence to which a product meets all of the attributes, characteristics and features of the product that the buyer and user of the product and regulatory agencies expect. So again, it's going to be different for different people. So moving on to the next slide, let us have a look at the relationship between quality and freshness. If first of all we look at quality, notice it's going to vary, as already said, from consumer to consumer. And if we start with nutritional properties, this will be important to some people. For example, they might want fatty fish to provide polyunsaturated fatty acids or vitamin A, whereas white fish, people enjoying the protein and the vitamin B. Price value. Now, this is a factor. For some people, there are price limitations, and therefore quality will be related also and affected by the price of the product they are buying. Consistency is yet another factor. For example, smoked fish can vary quite markedly in colour, and some people like a regular colour. They don't like different changes in that. Sensory properties, that's fairly obvious. What's it going to taste like? What's it going to smell like? What's the texture? And we'll be talking more about this when we are talking about sensory methods. Availability is also another factor. Some people want a regular supply. Purchasers will want, for processing, will want a regular supply. So this will be a factor in quality. Safety is fairly obvious. We don't want to be poisoned by eating the food. So looking at the microbiological aspects and some chemical aspects is a matter of quality. And finally, I've got convenience. In the UK, many people will buy battered or breaded white fish. All they have to do then is heat it up. So this is a factor of quality from their point of view, rather than buying fresh fish and battering it and cooking it from a raw material. They can just put it in the oven and cook it. So that's another factor in quality. Now, all of these factors feed into freshness, the second part of this slide. And if we look at freshness, volatiles are an important aspect of this. What does it smell like? You'll smell the fish and say this is off. So we want low levels of spoilage odours and compounds. And I'll be talking about this in this presentation. In the next presentation, when I'm talking about chemical methods, we will be looking at analysing some of these compounds like trimethylene, some of these volatile compounds that you can smell. Sensory analysis, well, this will be followed on in about 3 or 4 minutes. We'll talk about it in detail. Texture is another aspect. This comes into sensory assessment as well, but a low temperature short storage time will keep the fish fresh. Proteolysis, well, when proteins break down, these will release volatiles, etc., and affect the texture, and so you want limited proteolysis for a fresh fish. With fatty fish, we have a problem possibly of lipid oxidation. I will not be talking about fatty fish in the lectures today, but if they are rancid, you will smell the off odours. ATP. Now, ATP is, of course, the molecule that provides energy for the cells, and after death, this will break down, and this is a very useful chemical indicator, and I'll be talking about this in about 10 minutes' time. Finally, microbiological. We want low microbial counts, both from the point of view of health and, of course, from the point of view of freshness, the volatile that they're going to create. I'm not a microbiologist, and I'm only going to talk about chemical methods today. So that then is the end of my initial introduction. I now want to talk about specific sensory methods. So sensory methods, sensory assessment. This involves you using your senses, in other words, your nose, your eyes, and touch. And what we are looking at on the next slide is the visual appearance. What does the fish look like? The colour, the odour and aroma, the taste and flavour, and touch, mouthfeel, finger pressure. And what would you look for in a fish? So let's have a look at a fish, and what are we looking at? We're looking at the eyes, the gills, the skin, and the belly. With the eyes, what do they look like? Are they clear? What shape are they? Are they concave? Are they sunken? The iris, is it clear? Is it cloudy? And is there blood in the eye? These things change as the fish deteriorates. If you lift up the gills, you can have a look at those. The colour. Is there any mucus there? What does it smell like? The skin. What does it appear? Is it shiny? Is it slimy? Is it firm when you press it? And the belly, in the UK, fish are normally gutted to help them keep longer. And what you would do in the belly cavity, you would have a look in the belly cavity and look at the colour of it. Is it firm inside there? If the belly is intact, as it is often in Indonesia, is it firm? Is it burst? What is the vent like? So when you're buying a fish, these are the things you would look for. And a purchaser would want to assess roughly how long the fish has been on ice since the capture of the fish. And a consumer or processor or merchant would be very interested in this. They want to know how much longer they can keep this fish for before they need to throw it away or before they can process it. So if we move on to the sensory scores sheets and methods, the first one to talk about is the Torrey method. Now, this was developed in the United Kingdom in the 1950s, and in front of you will see the raw freshness score sheet. This is the score sheet that is used by assessors. And if you look at that, you can see that the sensory assessment is based on these previous factors that I mentioned: the eyes, the skin, the belly, and the gills. Now, the Torrey scheme there, if we look at that in a little bit more detail, we can see how it changes. The Torrey scheme gives a top score of 10 for an absolutely fresh fish, and as the fish deteriorates, the score falls down, and by the time it reaches 4, it is not acceptable for consumption. So if we home in perhaps and look at the eyes, initially the eyes would be bulging, convex, black pupil, absolutely crystal clear cornea. And this then changes slightly as it goes through. If we jump down to number 8, it is flattening. It is losing its brilliance. It deteriorates even more. It becomes slightly sunken. The pupil becomes grey, and the cornea becomes opalescent, not clear. And when it's not acceptable, it is sunken. A milky white pupil, opaque cornea, obviously not very good. The skin again changes from being bright, well differentiated colours, nice and clear, getting worse and worse until at the end, by the time it's unacceptable, there's slime on it, discoloration, wrinkling of the skin, and so very unpleasant. Texture, initially very firm and elastic, it goes through rigor and then softens up again, so it is firm and elastic to the touch when it's score of 7, which is quite a good score. It then gets softer and softer, and you can then push the finger in when it's still acceptable. The skin depresses, doesn't come back up very quickly, and it gets a little bit gritty. Looking at the flesh and belly flash, now I appreciate in Indonesia fish aren't normally gutted, but what we look at in the UK is in the belly cavity, is it nice and translucent? Is any blood there nice and red? And this then gradually deteriorates as you look through it, and by the time it gets to be unacceptable, the blood is brown, there's reddening along the backbone, it is not very pleasant at all. Same sort of thing with the kidneys and the blood. You can see the blood flowing easily to start with, and it gradually browns through, and by the time it gets to a score of 4, it is brown kidney blood. The last 2 columns here are the appearance and odour of the gills. Now, this is a very easy and quick way of looking at them. If you lift the gill up and look at it, it will appear initially lovely bright red. This is blood again, and there are very little odours at all. It'll be nice and fresh. You'll get some sort of seaweedy, shellfishy odours developing. Good quality ones, still slight loss of colour, and again seaweedy, shellfish odours. These are scores of 7 or 8. 6 and 5, the quality is deteriorating, still acceptable. There'll be some mucus there becoming a bit cloudy, a bit more discoloration, and the aromas that they have described here are bready, beery, malty, and just before it goes off it is sour milk or lactic acid. When unacceptable, there'll be brown discoloration, yellow bacterial mucus in the gills, and you'll get fatty acid odours, acetic acid, butyric acids, and other descriptions in stale cabbage water. Those then are the unacceptable levels. What one does with this score sheet is you score each of these individually and put a ring round the score for eyes, skin, etc. But at the end, you have to make a final decision. You look at all these, and hopefully they'll all be, for example, around about 6 or 7, or possibly more, better. And at the end, you have to decide on an average score, or a score to make one final score. This can either be a whole number or a half. So, for example, it might be 7 or 6 or 6.5. As I say, below, once it reaches 4, it is unacceptable. That is the TORI score sheet. On the next slide, you'll see the European Union freshness score sheet, which is very similar. I'm not going to go through this at all, but this only has 4 grades. Excellent, A, which is very good, B, acceptable, and C, not fit for human consumption. And if you look at those, you'll see they are very similar to the TORI score factors. That's the raw fish. There is a sensory method for cooked fish, and I'm talking about whitefish here, by the way, and this is a TORI one, again developed in the 1950s. And here we look at odour, flavour and texture, mouthfeel and appearance. Again, 10 is the absolutely fresh fish, 4 is unacceptable. And the odours are very similar to the ones that you get in the gills. But this is for cooked fish, so you'll microwave the fish and then taste it and smell it. And if you look at that, the odours, initially sweet boiled milk, starch, followed by strengthening these odours. Then it goes to seaweedy, which was similar in the gills. Then you have a neutral flavour, which is quite acceptable, and then it starts going off. If you look at 5, we're talking about boiled potato, boiled clothes-like. And when we get to 4, very similar to the gills, lactic acid, sour milk, acetic acid in 3, so going off. The flavour, well, it starts off with some sweetness or meat flavours, and it develops through to neutral flavours and then becoming insipid and off. The texture and mouthfeel is a bit more difficult. We very rarely get 10, so it's looking at how firm it is, getting softer with storage, and white again going to opaque and yellowy. Again, you do the 3 things there and make a final decision as to the overall score. That then is the TORI method for sensory assessment. What I'd like to move on to now is a quality index method. And the quality index method was initially developed by the Tasmanian Food Research Unit, as you can see on the slide here. And in this situation, it works the other way around. Demerit points are given for the same sort of factors we had with the TORI methods. Appearance, the skin, scales, stiffness, eyes, gills, and either the belly and the vent, or in the UK normally this would be replaced by belly cavity measurements and observations. So looking at these, we move on to the next slide, which shows the the Tasmanian Food Research Unit system for round fish. And with this, the best, I remind you, is 0. All the points are demerit points. So if you look at the surface, for example, 0, very bright, nice and fresh. But here you get a scale. Bright would be 1 demerit point, slightly dull 2, and dull would be 3. Similarly, skin. Is it firm? 0. Is it soft? 1. And we move through all of these various things. Let's just look, for example, at the eyes. In this particular one, are they clear? Absolutely 0 points, fresh. Are they slightly cloudy? 1. Are they cloudy? 2 demerit points. The gills. If we look at the gills there, you've got several factors there. Colour, mucus and smell. And very similar again to the Tory scheme is the colour characteristic. In this case normally red, then does it get dark, or does it change to become very faded? Now for each fish you have to do your own score sheets developing for this quality index method, and this is for typical redfish, but some fish have different coloured gills and you have to amend this score sheet to take that into account. Is mucus, is there no mucus, some mucus or excessive mucus? So that is gills again. And smell, does it no smell at all, very fresh? Is it fishy, is it stale, or is it putrid? So you add all these demerit points up and come to a total score, which for fresh fish, absolutely fresh, would be 0, and in this particular example it would go up to 32. But do bear in mind that you need to amend this to suit the fish you're working with. On the next slide I have got that score sheet that will be used based on the slide you just saw. So you mark each one of these, for example gills, as I went through before. You put your score in the right hand column and you add them up and you get a total score. So as again, fresh is 0, 32 would be off. Now you can amend this, and the objective is to actually get a linear relationship with your total score against days on ice. Now this is very useful because a processor can actually do this and say, right, this fish has been, for example, equivalent of 7 days on ice. This fish is not acceptable after 12 days, so I've got 5 days in which to get this processed and be able to sell it. So the aim is to get a linear relationship. Now if you move on to the next slide, this is a publication that we did in 2002, Journal of Food Science. We were looking at sea bass stored in ice. We're looking at the difference between cultured and wild sea bass. And in the slide, in the graph there, we stored it for 24 days, and this was research. It was very easy to get assessors for the first few days, but by the time it was 24 days old, the fish was not very good. And it was the dedicated researchers that assessed and gave the descriptors for this. Now the graph, they're going up from left to right, going up from 0 up to about 30. This is the TFRU score, the ones with the round circles in. You can see it's nearly a linear relationship, and there was a slight difference between the cultured and wild fish, but we had this linear relationship, so a processor could have used that and said, okay, this fish has been on ice for 10 days, and the rejection point we found out for these fish was around about 18 days when they were stored on ice. For interest, I've just put the Torrey sensory score. This is for cooked fish, and that starts in the top left hand corner at just below 10 and goes down to below 4 on the right hand side. That was for the cooked fish. So that is sensory assessment, and the objective, I say, is to see if the fish is worth buying and to identify how much longer you have before you need to process it or throw it away. Thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Tony Taylor, for the interesting lecture for the first session. So, ladies and gentlemen, and all the participants, we will have about 10 minutes for discussion. If you want to ask or to comment or say something to Professor Tony Taylor, we will have 10 minutes for you for the first session. Is anyone raise hand? Yes. Pak Ahmad Purnomo, would you like to speak now?
Thank you, Ibu Fronthea. Good afternoon,
Okay.
Professor Taylor. Can you hear my voice?
Yes. Okay.
Good afternoon. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, then. First of all, there is a regard from Dr. Sunaria.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah,
Marvelous.
he was your student, yeah?
He was my student, a very good student, and it's lovely to hear from him. Salam saya to,
there are so many, yeah? Yeah. I used to work with Pa Suyuti Nasran. You still remember him? Okay.
yes.
Now, Prof. Tony, I understand that what you explain is all about subtropical fish, right?
Yes.
So can you explain to us the differences of the behavior between tropical and subtropical fish in this matter, especially in the sensory characteristics and the modes of spoilage? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, in the next talk, I'm actually going to talk about chemical methods as well as sensory methods. And whilst in England, obviously, we work with round fish, cold fish that live in the North Sea. The temperature is around about 10 degrees Celsius, quite cold. And the fish in the North Sea, when they are put on ice, the temperature difference between their living conditions and ice is, about 10 degrees Celsius. The shelf life there will be about 12 days. However, when I had the pleasure of working at Universitas Diponegoro with one of their staff in senior TT30, Dr. Farid, who is a lecturer at Undip, and I supervised her looking at the storage of grouper and red snapper. Now, the fish in the waters around Indonesia live in a much warmer temperature. It's quite nice to swim in there. North Sea is not very nice to swim, but the temperature of the seawater there is much higher. And when you put the fish on ice, the metabolic reactions slow down more in fish from tropical waters than they do in fish from waters around England. And so the metabolism is slowed down more, and the fish therefore will last longer, and the storage life for something like grouper, if they're immediately put on ice, will be much longer than that for a cod or a haddock around England. So you'll have an extension of the shelf life to around about probably 18 days. And it's the water temperature which is affecting this extended shelf life. Of course, on the other hand, if you don't get them onto ice very quickly, then the warm temperature, the 29 Celsius or 35 Celsius on board the ship will cause the fish to deteriorate very rapidly. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I think one of the reasons is that the microflora of tropical fish cannot withstand with cold temperature, while the ones from subtropical, because they are used to cold temperature, they are more resistant.
Yes, yes.
That's why the shelf life is longer.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
thank you.
Yes, it's the whole metabolism, the fish and the bacteria. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will move to another questions. I saw one person to raise hand. Bu Ima Wijayanti is now in Thailand. Prof. Tony, she is one of our lecturer. And please, Bu Ima, your questions.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Ibu Fronthea. Thank you, Prof. Tony Taylor. Thank you so much for your sharing. I saw your last slide. I see that we can use you use only 5 terrain panelists, isn't it? 5 terrain panelists for your sensoric analysis. In our research, sometimes we cannot use a terrain panelist. We know that the terrain panelist maybe not always available, so we always use like a student or maybe a semi-trained panelist. And how about this case? Can we use like a untrained panelist or semi-trained panelist in some like good journal, international journal? If we can, how many percent of panelists that maybe usually we can use for this sensory analysis? Maybe this question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your very valid question. We were very fortunate when we were working with the sea bass and sea bream. This was the Food Research Centre. A lot of work was done on fish. We were based in Grimsby. And this was a European Union project. It was funded by the European Union. We were working with Hungary, Greece, and Moldova. And different universities had different aspects to look at. When we were doing the sensory assessment, we were very fortunate in that we had a large number of staff who were experts in fish. And this was a very different project. We had to arrange a completely new descriptor for these fish. There was no published descriptors for sea bream and sea bass. And we were looking at small differences between wild and cultured. So we used the staff and researchers who are working on fish to do these descriptors. Of course, you can use only semi-trained or students. And when you say how many do you need, well, the more, the better, is all I can say on that. So if you have students and they're doing with this, well, you can actually help, you can train them, of course, get them semi-trained quite easily. And I don't know if I can share my, let me just try and share my screen if I can. Is that shared now? No. Is that screen being shared now, please? Eva Fronthea, can you see my screen?
It's not appeared yet, Prof. Tony.
Oh dear, whoops. Hang on. I'm not used to Zoom. I'm sorry about this. No, I've lost it. Sorry, I'm gonna have to go without screen. Oh, wait, here we are. Is it there now?
Not yet? Yeah,
No,
it's there.
It's there.
Yeah.
Right. Okay,
Good.
fine. Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm not used to it using Zoom. Yes, in this one, let me say, if we looked at this, we had, as you say, expert panelists, and we were looking at the quality index method for the raw sea bream and sea bass. And it was very sharp for the young lady to find out that there were only a limited number of panelists. But you can see here that the bass start off with a score very close to 0 after day 1 when we started. And the demerit scores increased as we went through to about 22 days, by which time the fish was really very bad indeed. And you can see there's a slight difference between wild and cultured fish. Slight difference. There was difference in composition as well. We were looking at composition. We were looking at obviously the index methods here, but we also looked at volatiles that were coming off from the fish. And so by the time we got to 18 days, the fish were unacceptable. It was very interesting. We asked about people who experts. Well, we had some people in Greece doing this. These fish came from Greece, and our rejection point was 18 days. Their rejection point was 16 days. So the different countries had slightly different rejection points for this fish. We found them acceptable longer than the people in Greece did, but that was then the fish they normally ate. So after 18 days, making these descriptors was very unpleasant. The fish were they were unacceptable, and we were tasting them, spitting there, horrible, and you know, sniffing them. It was really very, very unpleasant. But we did some descriptors, and that was the results of our research. So going back to the point, Emma, your very valid question about number of panelists, the more the better. Thank you for your question.
Tony, I think we still have one more questions, and we still have about 2 minutes. Is that all right?
Yes.
Tony? Yeah. So I would like to read for you from Ibu Farida Aryani from Jakarta. Thank you, Prof. Tony Taylor, for comprehensive explanation of sensory method for analyzing fish freshness. May I ask questions here? In score sheet of sensory assessment, there are too many scales from score of 1 to 10 in TORI score, for example. Sometimes we face some difficulties in differencing between score 10 and 9, for example. Thank you. So the difference between score 9 and 10.
Yes. I don't think I've ever seen a score of 10. It's not that fresh. Yes, there are borderlines between many different things. You have to just make an assessment. You cannot be exact. You look at the scores. Is it an 8? Is it a 9? If you're not sure, you give 8.5. So you make your assessment, and it was differ slightly between people anyway. Will not always be exactly the same. I might give it a 7. Tony Garthwaite might have given it a 6, but you know, we would not be that different. And you look at them all, and at the end you have to make an assessment and give one score. So yes, it is not that easy, but if you're trained, you're going to be very, very close to it. You might be half a unit out. At the most, you'll be 1 out. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Pak Tony and Bu Farida. So I'm sorry because of the time of the first session is finished. And now we will have a short break for about 5 minutes. Back to MC, Rania Sahya.
All right, and now we will have around 5 minutes of short break. And for the committee who is in charge, I give it to you. THP. THP mengajar saya untuk bagaimana cara mengolah produk-produk perikanan yang memiliki nilai tambah. Di tahun 2008 saya melanjutkan pendidikan S2 ke Belanda, tepatnya di Universitas Diponegoro. Di sini saya mempelajari ilmu pangan dan saya sudah menetap di sini sekarang.
Nama saya Bayu Hendra Susetya. Sekarang saya bekerja di PT Bahari Mulia Utama, bergerak di bidang ekspor pasteurisasi rajungan. Saya menjabat sebagai Plant Manager.
Hai, saya Robi Maulana Rosadi. Saat ini saya bekerja sebagai National QC Manager di PT Philips Seafood Indonesia, bergerak di ekspor dan impor, serta proses pengolahan makanan berbasis seafood, pasteurisasi rajungan, frozen tuna, value added, dan sebagainya.
Saya, Fazlur Rahman Aziz, mengajak teman-teman untuk bergabung di keluarga THP Undip. Saat ini saya sedang menekuni bisnis di dunia perikanan juga.
Jadi jangan ragu untuk aplikasi di THP. There are a lot of opportunities out there. You just have to jump and grab it and follow really your passions. So a lot of success.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we now coming to the second session with the topic of fish quality and freshness, especially chemical methods. And I will invite Professor Tony Taylor for the second time to give our lecture for this second session. Please, Professor Tony Taylor, time is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Fronthea. And once again, I'm going to ask our expert at National Centre for Food Manufacture, our expert in information technology, to share his screen and show the talk that he made about me last week. So, Ben, if you could share your screen, please. Thank you. This is the second presentation concerning fish quality and freshness, and in this presentation I'm going to talk about chemical methods. Chemical methods can be used for several things. The first one is relation to quality, and we're looking at post-mortem changes within the fish that will relate to the quality of the fish. In other words, by doing a chemical assessment, we can look at the change in the quality during storage of fish. Now, if you're doing a chemical method, it is very important that the chemical value has some meaning. In other words, you have to relate it to sensory assessment. This will often vary between species. So, if your fish you're studying has not got the chemical values already researched and reported in the literature, you have to actually do a sensory assessment with the chemical assessments. Now, this has been done in several cases in two papers that I'm referring to here about sea bream and sea bass. Later on, you will see it here. And when I was working at Undip many years ago, one of the lecturers there, Ibu Titi Surti, undertook research looking at snapper and grouper during storage and maltreatment by not icing properly. And Dr. Farad and I and Ibu Titi Surti looked at chemical methods and sensory assessment of the fish and related the two things until the fish were spoiled. So that is the first use of chemical methods. On the next slide, you'll see other quality aspects that can be measured using chemical methods. For example, beneficial chemicals and components. So if you want to do a vitamin assay, obviously that would have to be done chemically.
Nanti lihat yang second.
Similarly, toxic chemicals, heavy metals, they can be a quality factor with fish. Once again, chemical method. If one is producing a fish product, which is containing other materials, potatoes, rice or anything like that, you will want to find the fish content within that food. And again, in these value-added products, you would need to do an assessment to work out the amount of fish, percentage of fish within that food product. Finally, you may wish to check additives, things such as polyphosphates and salt, how much has been added to that fish during the production of a food product. And once again, we're back to chemical methods. So what I'm going to talk about then is those changes that reflect and relate to fish quality. And on the next slide, we will see the first one of these, which is TVBN. This is total volatile basic nitrogen. So these are volatile bases. Obvious one is ammonia, but things like dimethylamine and trimethylamine are also volatile compounds. It is very easy to measure these. If you make it the homogenized fish alkaline, the volatile bases will be released into the atmosphere. You catch them in acid and then titrate. This is a Kellogg titration, which you also use for proteins, but in the case of volatile basic nitrogen, it is easier. You simply make the fish homogenate basic, make it alkaline. Some typical values for TVBN. In most fish, it's 35 to 40 milligrams of nitrogen per 100 grams of fish indicates that fish is spoiled. But it does vary. Examples I've given you here, up to 200 milligrams of nitrogen per 100 grams if you're talking about salted dried fish. Tuna is slightly lower, about 30 milligrams of nitrogen per 100 grams of fish for tuna. One critical point with this is that it is not a linear relationship with time. If you store fish in ice, the TVBN rises fairly slowly to start with, and then you have a rapid increase just before it becomes properly spoiled. So not a linear relationship, and I'll refer back to this later on. The next one I want to talk about is trimethylamine, or TMA. Now this is limited, it is only found in marine species and is formed from trimethylamine oxide. This is normally assessed using a colorimetric reaction. You can react with picric acid to give a yellow colour. Typical values, these are obviously going to be lower than TVBN because this is one of the components of TVBN. So normally about 1.5 milligrams of nitrogen per 100 grams is very good, and 10 to 15 milligrams of nitrogen per 100 grams becomes spoilt for most uses. And once again, as with TVBN, there is not a linear relationship between the time of storage in ice and the TMA released. The third chemical indicator I'm going to talk about, hyperxanthine, again very briefly on this one. Hyperxanthine has a bitter taste, and one of the things that makes the fish unpleasant, and this is formed from ATP breakdown, which we will deal with in a minute. This can be measured by either HPLC or enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays or a colorimetric method. Several ways in which one can assay this. And in this one, the upper limit for acceptability is about 40 milligrams per 100 grams. Hyperxanthine can also be measured enzymatically to uric acid. Histamine. Now histamine is limited. It is limited to Scombroidae or Clupeidae, fatty fish such as tuna, mackerel or herring. And histamine is formed from histidine, an amino acid found in the blood and flesh of these fish. And again, this is used by HPLC or ELISA or colorimetric method. And a limit of 100 milligrams per 100 grams is likely to result in histamine scombroid poisoning. You have a rash, etc. It's quite unpleasant. But the fish can actually sometimes appear fine. And it's normally an abuse before the fish were chilled. Finally, rancidity, and this is not of importance to white fish. Non-fatty fish has very little rancidity. The fatty fish, however, can have the fat going rancid and you get the typical rancid aromas. This can be assayed by peroxide values by titration, or thiobarbituric values, a colorimetric method. And limits there typically, if the peroxide value reaches 10 to 20 milliequivalents per kilogram of the oil, it is likely to taste rancid. And thiobarbituric acid values, these measure aldehydes and ketones, if it's more than the equivalent of 2 milligrams of malonaldehyde per kilogram of flesh, you will probably taste the rancidity. So if we look at the next slide, this shows the changes in concentration of total volatile bases, hypoxanthine and trimethylamine. In all of these cases, you'll see that up until about 10 or 12 days, the increase in their value is relatively slow. After that, it accelerates, and the TVN, for example, rises rapidly from about 10 days of value about 20, going up to about 60 milligrams of nitrogen per 100 grams after 20 days. This then is not useful as a predictor of storage life, but you can use it quite accurately to decide whether the fish is acceptable or not acceptable. I'd now like to move on to look at the nucleotide degradation in fish muscle. And the next slide shows the breakdown of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate is, of course, the molecule that supplies energy to the cells in cell reactions. Normally, ATP breaks down to ADP, the diphosphate, and releases energy, which is the chemicals in reaction in the cell use. It is then reconverted to ATP by oxidative phosphorylation, the fish using the carbohydrates, etc., to remake ATP. On the death of the fish, some ATP will be reformed from ADP by creatine phosphate and a little bit of anaerobic glycolysis. But it then continues breaking down. The ATP breaks down to ADP. It is not returned to ATP, so it will break down to adenosine monophosphate, then to inosine monophosphate, inosine and hypoxanthine. Now this breakdown can be used very usefully to look at the quality of fish. I say after the death of the fish, oxidative phosphorylation ceases and this pathway breaks down. So what will happen is the levels of ATP will fall very quickly. They will break down to ADP, etc. And at the same time, eventually, we will see an increase in inosine and hypoxanthine finally. If one looks at the ones in the middle, something like inosine monophosphate, this will often start to increase. ATP will be breaking down to ADP, to AMP, and inosine monophosphate, so the levels will be rising. But inosine monophosphate itself will be breaking down. And whilst the inosine monophosphate will initially rise, at some stage its breakdown will be faster than it is being formed. If it's breaking down faster than it is being formed, its level will fall. So very often in the case of inosine monophosphate, you'll see an increase initially in the levels of IMP and then a decrease. And of course, as it's breaking down, levels of inosine and hypoxanthine will increase. The next slide, looking at formation of hypoxanthine post-mortem muscle, shows the way in which it is done, the different enzymes that are involved in it. So I will not spend a great deal of time talking about that. The next slide shows the pattern of ATP breakdown compounds in rainbow trout. This was work done by a PhD student at the University of Lincoln in 2002. And if we look at this, it shows the levels of the breakdown products of ATP with time up to 9 days. you can see the ATP starting at day 0, around about 2.5 micromoles per gram, and this drops down very, very rapidly. In one day, it's virtually gone. Following on from this, the ADP, again, also fairly rapidly breaks down. The adenosine monophosphate does not show any high values at all, because that obviously breaks down fairly quickly. But if we look then at inosine monophosphate, the IMP, this is the compound that you see rises from day 0 at about 4.5 to day 1 up to 7.5. So the inosine monophosphate is being formed fairly quickly here, much faster than it's being broken down. After day 1, that starts to fall because it is now breaking down faster than it is being formed. So the levels of IMP then fall continually for the rest of that storage period. If you also then look at the inosine and hyperxanthine, those two compounds, you will see that they steadily rise from day 1, day 2 onwards and increase steadily up to day 9. Now these varying levels of these compounds can be used quite accurately to predict how long a fish has been stored in ice. So if we think back to the original pathway, the final two compounds we're looking at there are inosine and hyperxanthine. And you see from the graph in front of you, the inosine and hyperxanthine concentrations increase throughout storage. And the AMP, ATP, ADP levels fall rapidly, inosine rises and then falls. So if we look at the proportion of these two final compounds, the hyperxanthine and inosine, over the total of all of these compounds, ATP, ADP, AMP, IMP, inosine and hyperxanthine, the proportion of the hyperxanthine and inosine will increase as the fish deteriorates, as the fish is stored. And if we use a ratio of these two things, we can get quite an accurate determination of how long the fish has been dead and stored on ice. So if we look at the next slide, the K value is the sum of the inosine and hyperxanthine on the top divided by the sum of all the other components underneath. So ADP, AMP, IMP, hyperxanthine and inosine underneath, add all up, all the breakdown products up, and just have the two final compounds on the top. So as the fish deteriorates, the levels of inosine and hyperxanthine, the two top ones on this equation, increase. They become nearer and nearer the sum of the whole of the compounds. So this is the K value. And if you look at the next slide, it's normally expressed as a percentage. And here's the same thing again. The K value as a percentage is the hyperxanthine and inosine levels divided by the levels of all the others, ATP, ADP, AMP, IMP, inosine and hyperxanthine. That is the percentage K value. This is the one that is normally used, and one can check this and see if you get a linear relationship, and if so, you then have a very good indicator of how long that fish has been kept on ice. There are other values that can be used, which I'm not going to talk about. These are not used so often. The Ki value, for example, is inosine and hyperxanthine divided by IMP, inosine and hyperxanthine. You've simply missed out the ATP, ADP and AMP. The other ones, again, I'm not going to talk about at all. Let's just stick with the K value, which is the one that is normally used. If we look at the next slide, this is the rainbow trout again, the PhD work that was done in Lincoln some time ago. And this is the change in K value of rainbow trout for 9 days of still chilled storage. And you can see it's a pretty good relationship. So if you had a K value of say 40, you could say with good confidence that fish has been the equivalent of being 4 days on ice. If we go to the next slide, the graph here is published paper. This is sea bream, and we did work on sea bream looking at a whole range of different factors. So if we look at the storage time here, we went up to 24 days. The fish had gone off quite badly by then, but we looked at the different values. We measured obviously the components of ATP breakdown, which were all analysed by HPLC. So the ATP, ADP, AMP, IMP, inosine and hyperxanthine. And from these levels we calculated the various values. Now the K value is the one with the triangles, and you can see it starts off from 0 at day 0, day 1, and it increases steadily up to just about 40% by day 23, 24. So this was cultured sea bream stored in ice, and we measured that and had a nice, pretty good linear relationship, as you can see there. This was published in the Journal of Agriculture and Food Chemistry 2002, and the reference will be at the end of this presentation. If we move on to the next slide, this is showing cultured sea brass stored in ice. The R values are pretty good, very good linear regression on that. And if we look at the storage time, again we went up to 23 days, and if we look at that, you can see the K values on this one, which are the round open circles. Again, that increases from very small value at day 1 and goes up to about 65 at day 23. Now both these fish had a storage life, this and the bass had a storage life of about 18 days before we rejected them. So this shows that you need to have different K values for different fish. So the rejection values for these fish will vary according to the species. So if we looked at this, if we look on the next slide, the cultured sea bream, the rejection day was 17 to 18 days, and the rejection value, K value, was about 35 to 40. Cultured sea bass, on the other hand, rejection day very, very similar, day 16 to 17, and the rejection value here was a K value of over 50%, 50 to 55%. And here are a whole series of examples of rejection values. So if you have not got a literature value for this, you actually have to do the experiments yourself, as we did, and put in the literature, this is the K value, which is the limit of acceptance for that particular species. That then is an introduction to chemical assessments. What's the value of a chemical assessment? Why do one? Well, if you think back to sensory assessments, you really needed a whole fish. And if you haven't got a whole fish, you can't do the eyes, you can't do the gills, all you've got is the flesh. So if you have a fish fillet, fish mince, fish block, you cannot do a sensory assessment as we did with the Torrey scheme, etc. So a chemical method here is highly valuable. You can just do the assessment and say, well, this particular fillet, this particular block of fish was frozen effectively after the fish had been on ice for 4 or 5 days. And this then enables a processor or a purchaser to say, well, okay, this was good quality fish, and if I need a fish fillet, how long have I got before I have to process it? Okay, this fish, the sea bream, was equivalent to 7 days on ice. So I've now got 9 days before I have to dispose of it. It's no good. So it is highly useful in that. It is also objective as opposed to subjective. When you're doing taste panels, you need some people who have expertise in this to actually make a proper valued assessment. A chemical method, you go into the lab, you take the measurements, that's the value. But you, as I said before, you do have to have it related. This objective, accurate method has to be related to the subjective sensory assessment at some stage. And if it's not in the literature, you have to do it yourself. That is the end of this presentation. I will look forward to hearing any questions and trying to answer them. And at the end of this presentation, there will be the references if you wish to look at them. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Tony Taylor, for the second lecture session. Now we come. Yes.
Before I ask questions, I'd like to just go back. When we did the recording, I could not use my pointer. If I could have 2 minutes, I'd point out some more important points of this lecture if I share my screen.
Okay. Yeah.
Answer questions, if I can do that. Can you see my screen, Dr. Fronthea?
Yes, yes.
Right, if I move the pertinent points of this lecture, if we look at the total volatile basic nitrogen, the hypoxanthine and trimethylamine, this is the typical levels that we would see in fish around England, cod and haddock. And as I pointed out, if we look at total volatile basic nitrogen, it stays fairly steady to about 10 or 12 days. Now the fish go off around about this time. And so you can see here the level rises very, very rapidly. And so whilst total volatile basic nitrogen is no good to estimate how long you have before the fish goes off, I mean, here it is very, very little change. Once it does start going off and deteriorating, it is a good indicator that the quality has finished, the end of storage life. The same with hypoxanthine and trimethylene. These are not linear relationships. So if we move on then to the ATP products, ATP, as I said, breaks down ADP. This is what is going on in the cell all the time. It's releasing energy, it's being reconverted to ATP by oxidative phosphorylation. When the fish dies, it breaks down. So the levels here drop very, very rapidly, and we get the breakdown products accumulating. So these break down, and these are being formed. So the K value is very simply these last two products here. The sum of these two divided by all of them. Now, initially, there'll be very, very little inosine and hypoxanthine. The ATP, ADP will be working, going backwards and forwards. As these break down when the fish is dead, these decrease rapidly to zero, and these increase. Inosine monophosphate was the funny one. This very often it is being formed by breakdown of these. And initially, it builds up, increases in concentration. But it is also breaking down, and so after a couple of days, the level reaches maximum, and it will break down. It will build up more inosine and hypoxanthine. So the K value is very simply the concentration of these two divided by the concentration of the whole lot. So as these build up, the K value increases. These two divided by everything. So the proportion of inosine and hypoxanthine increase as the fish deteriorates. And as you can see here, this is sea bass, and there's the K value going up there, a lovely, pretty good straight line. And the same for sea bream, another very good straight line. The K value there, the triangle is very, very good. And this is an excellent example of how I said you have to do each one. This has not been done before. And if you look at the rejection values, the K value for bream was 35 to 40, whereas sea bass was 50 to 55. So you have to do it for each individual species. Anyway, that I hope will clarify a couple of points from the lecture. I will now look forward to trying to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Tony. Ladies and gentlemen, and all the participants, we now coming on the question and answer section so that we can discuss what do you want to ask or to give a comment to the second lecturer given by Professor Tony Taylor. Prof. Tony, please allow me to read. There are some questions from the audience already coming. First is from Ibu Ulfa Amalia. Ibu Ulfa Amalia is one of our lecturers as well. She is now doing his PhD in Hokkaido University, Japan. So her question is, it's an interesting topic related to fish quality values for chemical indicator, Prof. Tony. My question is, how about allergen content in seafood? For example, parvalbumin that contain in some fish and beta component in fish roe. Is it included into the indicator or different meaning? Thank you.
This will be a different meaning, and all we're doing with the indicators here is seeing effectively how long that fish has been dead and relating to the storage time in ice. So this is just showing how fresh the fish is. We're not looking at any other chemicals. For another one, for example, histamine, and you'd have to do your separate assays for each other chemical you want to look at. This is simply looking at the freshness of the fish, and any other aspects, allergens or harmful chemicals, you have to do those separately.
Okay, thank you. Is that answer? I think it's clear, Bu Ulfa. Thank you very much. And we have to move to another questions. This is from Obin Pampente. He write in bahasa. So I have to translate.
Saya tidak mengerti.
Tidak mengerti. So I will try to translate for you, Prof. Tony. Is there any differences of K value measurement from pelagic fish and demersal fish? How long do they have do they can condition fresh from room temperature? So the question is about the difference of method of K value measurement between pelagic fish and demersal fish. If is there any difference?
Yes, there are differences between all the fish. I've just lost my slide here. The K value works for both pelagic and demersal fish, and for fatty fish and non-fatty fish. Okay. But what you have to do is for each individual species, do your sensory assessments, do your chemical assessments, and then find the K value, which indicates the end of shelf life. Some of them, of course, are already published. I gave a little table earlier on showing the difference. Had tuna and red snapper and sea bass. So the answer to that is yes, the K value can be used for demersal fish, pelagic fish, fatty fish, white fish, but if it's not in the literature, you will have to do the work yourself and relate the sensory assessments to the K values.
Okay, so hopefully that's answered the question. Pak Zumar ya. Another questions is from Umbudawa. From Pak Umbudawa. In determining the quality of fish meat, is there any difference in the quality of fish meat from different water locations? And does it have an impact in processing as a food additive?
That's a very good question. The only thing I can think of is that there are examples where there are pollutants in the water. For example, there's mercury, methyl mercury, that was found in tuna many years ago from particular areas. And of course, that did affect the quality. Other than that, you would have to actually see if there are any differences in habitats. And if you look at the differences between wild and cultured fish, they live in a different environment. And some of the work we did, the wild fish, sea bream and sea bass, would tend to have lower fat contents than the fish that were cultured. They'd also not only have they'd have a lower level of fat if they were a wild fish, because they're using more energy swimming around, chasing their food. They'd also have a different fatty acid composition because of the food they were being fed. The wild fish were eating things they were catching naturally, whereas the cultured fish, they were being fed food, and this affected their fatty acid composition. So yes, the environment can affect the quality and composition of the fish.
Thank you for the question, the answer, Prof. Tony. Now move on to the third question coming from Zusmar. Mr. Zusmar Ervin Tulus from Kepulauan Riau, Sumatera. The question written in Bahasa as well, so I will try to translate. So, is there any requirement or regulation for Indonesian fisheries product that will export to European country?
I'm sorry, I cannot answer that question. I do not know. I have retired. I'm a pension. I'm not up to date. I cannot answer that question. Possibly one of my colleagues could, but I cannot. I'm sorry.
It's okay, Pak Zumar. So Pak Tony mengatakan tidak dapat menjawab pertanyaan ini karena beliau saat ini sudah pensiun, sehingga bukan maksudnya mungkin Prof. Tony tidak mempunyai wewenang untuk menjawab hal ini begitu. Mohon maaf, mungkin nanti Bapak bisa menanyakan.
Maaf sekali Pak, saya bisa menjawab.
Maaf sekali, it's okay. Now Pak Ahmad, from Pak Ahmad, why is there a certain type of fish whose flesh is hard when processed? Does it affect the method of death of our fishing gear used?
Sorry, can you rephrase that question?
Yeah, why is there a certain type of fish whose flesh is hard? So the flesh fish or some of fish, if it is processed, then affected to the hardness of the flesh, of the texture. Why? I mean, maybe different fish when it is being processed, becoming some of them becoming harder than the other.
Are we talking about comparing different species or one species?
Different species.
I don't know. I mean, if you're talking about a particular species, then how it's been handled post-harvest will affect the quality and the tenderness of it. But different species will have different textures anyway. And in the UK, the different fish will have a different texture simply because the way their biological makeup. I'm not sure if that's answered the question or not.
Yes, because sometimes they have different method of death, or I mean different fishing gear they use to catch. Then maybe give the effect of if they are being processed.
I think that'd make a very good research project.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously, looking at capture fish by different methods and make sure they are nice and fresh, captured, and then see what effect it has on quality. An excellent research project would be my suggestion.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And now I have a look at the hand raised from Pak Ahmad Purnomo again. Pak Ahmad Purnomo, please directly to give your questions to Prof. Tony.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Taylor and Ibu Fronthea again. Okay, can I help in answering some questions?
Yes, of course.
Yes, the answer from Riau. Yeah, there are some requirements to export your fish to Europe, and first of all, is that that you have to be registered. Your company has to be registered by EU authority. Then you will have to meet the requirements, especially in food safety and quality, of course. Yeah, and one of the requirements is that you will have to have HACCP in place in the factory. That's the very basic requirement. And number two, I think the question from Pak Ahmad, not from me, but from the other Ahmad. Yeah, Pak Taylor. Yeah. Let me check again. Yes. Why is there a certain type of fish whose flesh is hard when processed? I think one of the causes is that it's in the post rigor. So if we have the fish in rigor mortis, and then we cook the fish, or we fillet the fish, then we will have difficulty because it's hard, of course. Yeah, it's stiffened. You know that, Pak Taylor. Yeah, and also because of the way of death. Yes, it's quite true. If your fish is in stress condition, this will affect also the quality of the fish, and the muscle or the meat can be harder than the others. I think that's the yes, some information that I would like to add to the explanation of Professor Taylor. And
thank you very much, Pak Ahmed, for your expertise in importing and exporting. Much appreciated.
Okay, Ibu, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Ahmad Purnomo, for helping us to answer the questions. Another question from Pak Laude, Professor Laude M. Aslan. This is our colleague as well. Thank you for Prof. Taylor for your important explanation of sensory method. Oh, this is about sensory method for analyzing freshness. My question is, this sensory method could be used for other animals such as sea cucumber?
I have no idea. I've never worked with sea cucumber, so I don't know.
Sea cucumber.
It's a very interesting one. Yes. I'm not aware of any research done on that. You'd have to actually look up the literature, and if it hasn't been done, well, as we did with sea bream and sea bass, you work on it and devise your own scheme and modify as appropriate from the sensory schemes.
Okay. There are lots of
That's a very interesting question.
interesting question. And the other question is from Ibu Farida Aryani. You mentioned that limiting K value for fish rejection is different between species. What do you think about the categorized proposed by Ukiyama that K value of 5 is freshly captured, 20 to 40 for surimi, kamaboko, and more than 60 is spoiled or rejected?
Well, if it's been done for surimi and kamaboko, it's been done. No, I have not worked on that. I say this is processed fish, so one assumes that work has been done on that and that has been published, therefore it would be correct.
Okay. Another question from Bu Farida Aryani. Regarding to DPS, one species of fish will have one character, which is not always similar to another. So it should create DPS for each fish. Is there any chance to classify for some fish which have similarities to be one group, i.e. fatty acid one group, lionfish another group, or pelagic fish in one group and demersal fish in another group? Thank you.
Sorry, start the question again. Could you repeat that, please?
Okay. This is about the DPS, the demerit point score.
Oh, demerit, yes, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I honestly, yes, I wasn't familiar. Yeah, the quality index method, the demerit point score. If you look at the different species with different values, I don't think you could really put them into groups. You've got to just look at individual species. I mean, sea bass and sea bream, there's quite a big difference there, 35 to 50. They're very similar fish. They're white fish. And if you look then at something like mackerel or tuna, they're both fatty fish. And again, they have quite different K values. And so that's the K values. The demerit scores, I'd have to think on that one. I think there'll be differences. You have to do them according to individual species. With the sea bream and sea bass, the demerit scores, you have to change them because the individual parameters do change. For example, the gills, in one of them we had to change. They did not follow the normal pattern. They went brown. They didn't change as the initial scheme I showed you. You had to amend it to suit the changes within that fish. So you change your quality index demerit scores according to species to fit that species, get a linear relationship.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Tony, for the answer. I think there are many good questions, and thank you very much for all of the questions that have been asked by the participant, and also for the good answer from Professor Tony Tyler. Huh? Oh, there is still one more question from Ibu Farida Aryani. Please, Bu Farida.
Thank you, Bu Fronthea. I just respond the answer from Prof. Taylor. So it is a must that we have to create the DPS score sheet for each species. Is it right?
you do not have to. What you would do is to try have a look at the demerit scores that work from the initial Tasmanian Research Unit's score sheet. Look at that and see if it does fit your fish. And in many cases, it will fit it, but sometimes it does not fit it, and then you have to change it. So the answer is yes and no. Sometimes it is fine, you don't need to change it. Other times you have to look at it and say, well, it doesn't quite work for the gills. The gills don't change as the way they did in that sheet. You then amend it to suit the fish you're working with.
So when we want to standardize the score or the value of DPS, will be a little bit difficult because many scores depend on the species. Is it right?
Well, yes. If you look at the you just have to yes, it is right. Yes, you have to look at it and see how it goes. I mean, many species will be very similar, of course. So, but yes, if you have a literature value, you work from that.
Okay, it is possible, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Prof. Fronthea. It's clear voice for me. Yeah.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you for all of the questions. And now, ladies and gentlemen, and all the participants, it is time to end, unfortunately. And we still have some question actually, but the time goes by, so we have to finish for all our lecture today. And finally, we come to the end of this general lecture, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the speaker for Professor Tony Taylor for his informative and interesting presentation, and all the participants for their very active participation. And I myself, I do apologize if there are many mistakes that I have made as a moderator. And now, finally, please give applause to the speaker and for yeah, Pak Tony.
Yes. Before we say goodbye,
okay.
Can I say I'm delighted to be working with Undip again. Thank you very much for asking us.
Okay.
Saya senang sekali bahwa Universitas Lincoln dan Universitas Diponegoro akan kerja bersama-sama lagi. Saya tahu akan dengan berhasil. So thank you very much indeed, and it's been an honor to give the talk. Thank you very much for all the questions, very interesting questions, and I look forward to future collaboration. Thank you very much.
Okay, today finally I would like I have to end this general lecture and this meeting for today. It is very interesting for the reunion of
yes.
The reunion closing.
Terima kasih. Thanks.
Yeah. So finally, please give a big applause to Professor Tony Taylor, all the participants. Thank you again, Prof. Tony Taylor. Hopefully next week we will have the second world-class university program of Undip and University of Lincoln. And thank you for today. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
And I'll give back to our MC, Mbak Rania Salsa.
Thank you, Professor Anthony, for the engaging lecture session. And thank you to Dr. Fronthea for the nice lecture session leading. Therefore, our lecture session went very well. And I also got so many new things I didn't know in my study. And unfortunately, that was our last agenda for today. And thank you to all of the guests and participants for coming. And I'm hoping to see you again on another chance. And we also have the second session of visiting lecturer on October 26th, titled Seafood Authenticity and Integrity. As you can see on the screen, that is our second session of visiting lecturer. I hope to see you again on the next session. And I'm Sasa, as your Master of Ceremony for today, standing back. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Diponegoro University has been moving ahead to be the best university in Indonesia by providing 13 faculties of undergraduate and postgraduate. Diponegoro University has graduated 300,000 qualified alumnus. Diponegoro University also establishes vocational schools to generate a ready-to-work alumnus. Holding the fighting values of Pangaran Diponegoro, such as honest, brave, fair, and attentive, Diponegoro University keeps producing excellent alumnus nationally and internationally, while also contributing in the development of knowledge, technology, art, culture, and exercise.
Diponegoro University now is a rising star. We have planned to become one of university in 500 world university rank. We have been continuously improving the supporting aspect such as regulation, facilities, financial system, bureaucracy management, information system, as well as quality of human resources, quality escalation of three Dharma perguruan tinggi. As the primary target of Undip, by stimulating the downstream of research outcomes that can be beneficially implemented for the society. We are also keen to improve the quantity of national and international academic publication, as well as the number of doctorates and professors in Diponegoro University.
Now, Diponegoro University has been improving in two important aspects of achievement: institutionally and student achievement. Diponegoro University has become a world-class university by being ranked 5th amongst almost 5,000 universities in Indonesia. Meanwhile, the students' achievement in both national and international scales of prestigious events are increasing. The vision to be an eminent research university is supported by the continued increase of research funding. The total research and civil service funding in 2018 is 123.7 billions rupiah. It consists of PMBP, the National Competition Research Funding, and Collaboration Research Funding. The intellectual property right becomes the indicator of significantly improved research. The patent consists of simple patent, patent, international patent, software, and invention legal letter. To support the academic process,